Hey everybody. Appreciate y'all coming out, and I'm pretty excited to share some of the work that we've been doing, focusing on accessibility at scale. This quote by Tim Brown: "Empathy is at the heart of design, and without understanding what others see, feel, and experience, design is a pointless task." And as experienced professionals, we have this deeply held feeling that we're not designing for ourselves, right? We're solving problems for other people. And just like Justin mentioned in his opening keynote, like the idea of like seeing past our own personal use case. And our whole thing is about making products and services that are easier for people to use and navigate and understand. And we love solving the problems that people face, but oftentimes the solutions are the problem for a lot of people. The sad reality is that even the best user experiences that address specific business needs, they fulfill user requirements that we hear and research in the field, and we've addressed usability issues that have come up during testing. Even then, those same experiences can frustrate, but also exclude and do real harm to people with disabilities. And so, just to kind of give a sense of the scope, if you're familiar with WebAIM, they're a nonprofit, and they're a really great resource for accessibility information and things like that. And they do an annual audit of the world's top 1 million websites. And they look at the homepage of the top 1 million sites, and they do an automated test to find out like what's the accessibility state of the web, just kind of a pulse check. And 97.4% of those 1 million websites had accessibility issues. And again, this is just with automated testing, which only accounts for maybe like a quarter, more or less, of the types of things you could detect of accessibility issues. And the good news is that this is actually an improvement from last year. And the reason why the chart looks like a C, because that stands for crap, so hashtag data storytelling. But what that means is that the average homepage, which has around 900 elements, a user could expect to encounter an accessibility issue on 1 out of every 17 elements that they encounter. And then, if you take into account, the fact that automated testing only accounts for like a quarter, if you were to actually do manual testing, it's probably going to be closer to 100%, right? The state of web accessibility is not good. It's in a really sad state. And, again, going back to the idea, like we care about solving problems for people and not introducing problems. And I think, when you start to get a sense of the problem that accessibility issues cause for people, we feel like we need to do something, and it's the right thing to do. In a lot of cases, it's the legally required thing to do. And in smaller organizations, you can probably get away with the checklist. You can have like a list of things that your designers need to make sure that they've accounted for, developers need to make sure that they've accounted for, and even PMs and BAs. But if you work in a large agile environment with rapid releases, you're going to have multidisciplinary teams, and probably multiple of those multidisciplinary teams, different business units that you're supporting. And as you start to give some thought to, how do we address accessibility, it can feel overwhelming pretty quickly. And that's how I was feeling at the beginning of my journey into like accessibility at scale. It felt really overwhelming because, you start thinking about training. You have all these different disciplines, all these different people. How do you train them? Is this going to have an impact on our velocity? And the example that I'll give at the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, it's a government agency, but it's really rapid paced. We have daily releases, super fast paced. We can't introduce things that are going to slow down and like bog down the U.S. immigration process, right? Is this going to affect budgets and cost? And how do I make the case for this to leadership? If it's a private sector company, you might face a little more challenge. In government, there's a legal requirement, but still trying to introduce some practices and change things up can still be really hard. So I want to share, some of the things that I went through and my team went through. The good news is it's actually a lot easier than you might think, especially in a large enterprise organization, because you tend to have standardized tools. You have standardized processes. And so, again, I want to share a little bit about our process of, scaling accessibility at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And hopefully you might find some inspiration in how you might be able to do the same in your organizations. My name is David Herring. I'm an experienced lead at Publicis Sapient. I've been there about 4.5 years. And I'm on a long-term project at USCIS. I'm part of an experienced team of 15 researchers, designers, and content strategists. And it might sound like a big team, and I think in a lot of cases it is. You'll see that we're actually pretty small compared to everybody that is there to support it. The system that we're supporting is called ELIS, or the Electronic Immigration System. And this is an internal tool that immigration officers and some contractors will use to review and process and adjudicate applications for immigration benefits. Is, for example, used for DACA, so the deferred action for childhood arrivals. If you're getting a permanent resident or green card, those applications come in through this system, and it's reviewed and decisions are made. And that's how the tool is used. So just to give a little bit of sense of the scale, this is a sample of some of the things that happen on a daily basis. You have 2,500 petitions for family members. Over 6,000 green cards are issued. We have 2,000 new citizens that are naturalized every day, also done through the system. And 26,000 case decisions are made every single day. There are 19,000 employees and over 200 global offices. Now, as far as the product team that's putting this together, there are 30, we call delivery teams, but they're development teams with about 10 people, 10 developers, a BA, and there are daily releases. So, there's a lot going on, and sometimes the analogy that we use is like building the airplane while it's in flight. You can't really land this thing to kind of reevaluate and start over from scratch. So we had to start thinking about like how do we bake this into what we're doing now, and how do we kind of evolve as we're going. Until very recently, a surprisingly large number of immigration benefits were processed by paper. And this is a picture from the Chicago field office. And this was taken a few years ago, showing some of the cases that were to be assigned for the day. With paperwork, going across the country, for each stage of the case life cycle. And so, we're working, constantly. There are all these cases going on. How do we make them available in ELIS for electronic processing? So again, there are 15 of us, which again can sound like a big UX team, but we're supporting 30 development teams, again with daily releases, and with case decisions happening at the scale that they're happening, and across the globe, 24/7. Again, we don't really have the luxury of slowing it down. So I want to share a little bit about our process at USCIS. And it really started with a simple design when we first got there. There were a couple of benefit types. And when I say benefit types, it's like an application for a specific immigration benefit that were available in ELIS. And so when we first got there, it was like, trying to understand the process. And we did a UI inventory to find out what are the UI patterns, what are the components that we can build with, so there's some consistency in the designs that we're providing. And so we did this inventory, and we found that there wasn't really a systematic way of handling UIs in place. For pretty much anything that you wanted to do or any component, there were at least a few different ways to do it. You can see there are like 4 different toggles. We did a scrape of colors in the CSS, and you can see people had been eyeballing colors using eyedroppers for quite a while. So, again, when we were trying to, do one of these early designs, we got a sense of what the problem was. We were looking for some of the reoccurring, UI patterns that we could use here for that consistency. And we saw some that were used in a couple of places, so we thought, we're good, we'll use this. And, it went through that, product development lifecycle. We understood the problem, we did a design, it got developed, it got tested, it got deployed. We're thinking, okay, that's great. What we learned, though, is that, in a lot of cases, most of the time, accessibility testing didn't happen until sometimes much later in the process. And in this case, it was months later. So we had an issue that came up with one of these early designs that, hey, this component that was used has an accessibility issue. So, while it's understandable that there's a lot of work that's going on. Maybe, they're trying to get things out there as fast as possible. They're trying to support refugees, international adoptions, people applying for their families and loved ones to come stay with them. But things were falling through the cracks. It was kind of surprising, though, because we were using design components that were already there. We weren't like designing anything specifically new. So just given the fact that these patterns were already in use in a lot of places in Ellis, kind of got us wondering, like, if that's there, what else might be there? And it turns out that there was a lot. And so we're like, yeah, how do we stop these things from falling through the cracks? Ellis's accessibility was not in a good place. We needed to find a better way. But again, we couldn't stop the process. We couldn't just, put a pause on things, figure it out, and then start from there. U.S. immigration has to keep going on, so how do we support it? Couple of the challenges, it's a fast-paced environment, can't slow down immigration, got to keep things going. Again, there are a lot of different roles, a lot of different people there. I mentioned 30 development teams, almost 300 developers. How do we make sure that all of the people who are supporting the system know what they need to do for their part to make sure that we're creating something accessible? We did give checklists a try. They don't scale. It can work with smaller teams, but in that kind of environment, it didn't work out. And then, again, there's the concerns about cost and time. Like, what is this going to introduce, and how is it going to be received by leadership? So we had growing pains. There was a lot of learning, but where we are now in our philosophy towards accessibility, is summed up pretty succinctly by this quote by Derek Featherstone. He says that accessibility is an outcome, but inclusive design is a process. And so by looking at that product development lifecycle, each of those stages from discovery, design, development, and so on through the end, looking at those and identifying those opportunities where, we could build into the tools at that step, build into the processes at that step, those things that would get us closer to an accessible outcome at the end. So, it's got to be part of the process. You can't, you have to plan for it at the beginning. You can't just slap accessibility on at the end. It's not going to work out well for people. I saw this image of these now accessible stairs where, I feel bad for anybody trying to go down that in a wheelchair. So, we had to make a leftward shift in both our thinking and our approach. Random accessibilities were not going to result in accessible outcomes. We learned that. So some of the lessons that we learned are everybody can't be an expert. And this lesson is kind of meta. It ties into everything else. So I'll go through this in a little, kind of high level, and then jump into it in a little bit more detail, when we go into some of the other lessons. But, there's no way that we could train every single person, in every single role and what they needed to do to make their work accessible. And so what we did is we baked it in wherever we could. And we can't bake it in everywhere, but there was a lot that we could bake in. And I'll share some of that, what we could bake in and what we couldn't. We also wanted to offload as much of the education effort as possible, for the same reason. But if we're able to have the tools do a lot of the work for you and, introduce things into reviews and processes, that's going to take care of a lot of it. There's still going to be some manual work. It won't take care of everything. But a big part of the success was introducing a design system. And that was a game changer for us. So we introduced almost said a game system, a design system called Beacon, which stands for the Statue of Liberty's beacon that she holds. And we're basically able to say, Beacon can do X and Y for you. We have things built into it, but there are some parts you'll have to do on your own. And I'll show, how we address some of that. And we also wanted to empower people by showing them, giving them the information that they needed in order to support, the work that they're doing, and also direct them to the resources if they need additional information and support. So, after the tools do whatever part of it that they can do, it's like, here's guidance, some additional guidance in the design system. And, we also have a Microsoft Teams channel called Beacon Bits. And so it's like, if you get stuck on something, reach out. And now that we've been remote, it's been, helpful to have that communication tool available. So the next lesson is knock out what you can at each stage of the process. So thinking back to that product development lifecycle, you want to try to take care of as much of it as you can before it goes on to the next person. So by the end, you're left with specific things that you can hyper focus on, and kind of rest assured that so many of these other things are already taken care of. And so here are some of the ways that we've done that. So for requirements, accessibility is a requirement for requirements. What I mean by that is, for our user stories, we use Jira, and we've created a custom ticket template. And it is necessary, it's required to indicate whether something has an accessibility impact. In this case, because it's government, we're referring to it as 508. But it lets us track those things that we know need to be reviewed for accessibility, or something that we need to keep an eye on so that we don't end up in a situation where something gets reported into customer support, or it comes up some other way and we're only finding out months later. So we're able to keep track of things, keep track of the process. Aside from the metadata that goes into the ticket, the actual content itself, the content of the ticket, has a required section for accessibility considerations. And so, in this example, it's for an indeterminate loader for the design system, so where you can't really tell exactly how long it's going to take, but you want to show something's happening. So, in this case, we're saying that this, when it's developed and in the design system, it's got to be in an ARIA live region. And that basically says when it shows up on the screen, it's going to announce itself to a screen reader. And, there are other things like, supporting text that goes along with it. But the requirements, the accessibility requirements for those things like typography is already built into those components. So we don't necessarily have to address it specifically here. And so it kind of cascades. And so, when it's baked in at that level, it all comes together nicely. The other focus was on the design system itself and on the design tools that we're using. We recently migrated from Angular to React and Storybook. And so for each of the components, there's reusable code. And in this example, this is for an input field. And what one of the accessibility requirements is that you identify both what the form is for and you identify it with a specific label. So the screen reader set, when you're on that input, it tells you what it's for. And so we have placeholders for it. Now, this isn't going to automatically make sure that it has the most logical value in it, right? You might want to say that it's an input for a first name. But we have that placeholder in there, so the developers know, they'll see that, and it's simple for them just to go in and modify it at that point. Yeah, it's again. So there's parts that we can put in there, but there are some manual parts that have to be accounted for. And one of the things that we're thinking about too are introducing guardrails. So if we run a scan of the code and we find out that the default value isn't there, we could be like, hey, developer, you need to go in and put something meaningful here. And with each of the components in the design system, we have accessibility considerations for each part. So again, this is for an input field. Along with when to use this component and language guidelines, we have accessibility considerations that go into some of those things like, hey, we're accounting for this and this for you. There are placeholders to make the markup semantic, but here's some other things that you should consider when you're actually using this in practice. And depending on the tool that you use for a design system, we're using Storybook. There are some built-in accessibility tools. In this case, there are ways to simulate different types of color blindness. So if you want to see what someone with blurred vision might experience when they're looking at your design, those kind of tools are built in. I'll go into some of the other tools that are part of the design system in a bit. But as far as the actual tools that we use for design and for our prototyping, we have a widget library that matches one-for-one the components that are available in the code-based design system. And all of those have been reviewed for the accessibility criteria that apply to them. So anything like color contrast, tab order, how we treat errors, how we treat confirmation messages, form controls and their labels and things like that. All of that's already built into the design toolkit. In this case, we use agile. But those are things that we don't have to, it's not a burden on the top of our mind anymore because we know that those are accounted for. And so we can focus on the things that we know that wouldn't be accounted for otherwise. So it kind of narrows down the scope of our focus and make sure that we're able to address those accessibility issues before they ever roll out. And then finally, for automated testing, automated testing it's a great tool. It'll knock the basics out for you. Again, around a quarter of the potential accessibility issues, it'll pick up. And we do it in two parts. One is in the design system for every component and pattern, and also in the UIs that are the UI components that are being brought into an interface that's going to go into production. So for the components themselves, we have in Storybook, there's a plugin that lets us do automated testing of the components as soon as they're submitted. The nice thing about it is, depending on the the guidelines that you're working with, either WCAG or Section 508, you can customize the library or the criteria that it's checking against. And that process kind of looks like this, where someone will develop a component. There's a commit, there's the accessibility scan, and then if anything comes up, it's a fix. And then it goes back through, they commit again, and then when everything is good, it's merged in. And so all of the components, not only are they usability tested, but they're accessibility tested. And finally, you still need experts. You can bake in accessibility as much as you can, but you still need people who For example, like with automated testing, right? It's going to catch things for you, and it's a great tool, but you still need people who know how to evaluate the results of those, know what to do with them. You still need to do manual testing, because as accessible as you make the individual components, like the individual components could be 100% accessible on their own, but when you bring them all together, it doesn't necessarily make for an accessible experience overall, and probably you can guarantee that it doesn't. But we also have accessibility built into our design review process. So we have, two reviews. One is a design review for the solution itself. Like, I think it's the one that we're kind of most familiar with, where it's like the team presents, hey, this is the problem that we're solving for, this is the design, and you can get feedback from people and consider other potential solutions. But another review that we have is called a design pipeline. And basically what we're doing in that one is we're reviewing for design compliance. Because we have our established design principles. We have the design system that we're using, but we've introduced accessibility into that as well. So not so much looking at the particular solution, but is it compliant with those? And one of the ways that we are using that is we have the pipeline channel. Designers will submit their prototype design, give a basic overview, very high level about what it is that they're working on, and we'll have people that go in and review against the design system and against our accessibility criteria. Again, those things that you can't really bake in or automate. And what we did for the accessibility part is we took the accessibility criteria that apply to that particular deliverable, which in most of the cases, they're prototypes. And what we did is the guidelines include, a bunch of technical stuff too that don't really apply. So we noted down the ones that were relevant and, that apply to a UI or an interaction design or content, and in some cases video content that we produce. And we created this resource for designers. Now, we don't expect designers to go to this and read it, and be like, okay, I know what I need to do. But the way that we use this resource, again, written, kind of rewriting these requirements in a plain language that, our designers are going to read it and know what it means, categorized, by topics like content, images and graphics, forms, but we'll provide feedback in that pipeline, and we'll say, hey, in reviewing the design, this particular part's not compliant, and this is some of the reason why, and, in that, we provide a link back to that resource, and when they click on it, it opens right up to it. And so, the outcome of that has been really successful. When we first started this process, at the beginning, we would find like each design would easily have 4 or 5 accessibility issues that we would, kind of guide people through and link back to these resources. But, within just a couple of months of using this, most of the designs, they may have like 1, but a lot of them have none. And so like designers are learning from this, right? They're seeing the things that are coming up with their designs. They're understanding what the problem is and who it impacts. And they're not they're not introducing these same issues again. So it's been very successful in that way. And again, perfectly accessible parts. So everything in our design system, we can say this is accessible. But again, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that what comes together at the end is going to be an accessible experience. And so we do have manual reviews, and it goes beyond things like, is there enough color contrast? That's accounted for. We can focus, on like what breakdowns might be occurring when they all come together as a whole. And so it eliminates a lot of the burden that might, take more time or cause these kind of reviews to be delayed until much later in the process when they need to be happening earlier. Leadership has to buy in. This probably a given, but it's key, so I wanted to call it out. The thing is, when people are certain that their leaders value and prioritize and are committed to making things accessible, then everyone else is also going to value it and prioritize it and be committed to it. So you need to make sure, you need that buy-in from leadership. You need them to communicate it. The other thing too is that, leaders exist at every level in an organization. So it's not just like people in the most senior positions. Within your development group, within your design group, within your group of BAs, you have people whose voices are recognized as experts. People value their opinions, and so having establishing the relationship with these people, understand helping make sure that they understand the importance and what's required from their groups, and being vocal about it is essential to making sure that this scales out and that people are doing the parts that they need to do. So we need those champions at each level. We taking a look at some of the outcomes, some things, to be completely honest, are still coming up. I mentioned that there are still some parts that have to be done manually. We might put a placeholder in, but someone didn't, put a meaningful value in there. We've made really great progress. I wanted to look at the latest numbers. I think it's like mid-80s of percentage of tickets from before till now that are getting raised after things have been deployed. I forgot my PIV card, so I couldn't log in and quite get those. But there's we're catching a lot of things early on, and with being accessibility focused at each step of the way, there's a significant reduction in the rework that has to be done, right? So in the example that I gave at the beginning, that design went out, something came up, we had to go back and fix it. It takes time, it takes money to do that. We're not seeing that, and the numbers are just going down. Ellis itself is more maintainable. Beacon, the design system, serves as our single source of truth, both for code and design. And so if anything does come up later, if we realize, there's, maybe there was, something that could be done to make an experience more accessible with the particular component, because it's baked into the design system, that change can be made and then propagated out to the entire system everywhere where the instance of that exists. So we're able to rectify those issues if they do come up much more quickly. But this also means that the quality of our design and code is much better, and the entire process is a lot faster. We don't have to reinvent the wheel with design. And the elements that we're using, they're, all of them are, we're baking in accessibility where we can. We're taking care of, steps like including semantic markup, even though there's a manual component to that. But, it takes care of so much so that by the time you're towards the end, you really can focus in on just those things that are, kind of outside of the scope of that. It reduces that, and it really lets you raise our focus on those things that need the attention. So there's not as much left to be manually tested. I mentioned that in the design pipeline, a lot of the designs that we're seeing now, you might have one accessibility issue that comes up now. But in a lot of the cases, like in this one, there's no issue. It may be partially because we reward people with celebratory gifts when we reply if nothing came up, but I'm happy to say that Ellis's accessibility is in a really good place now. We've come from, random accessibility tests, finding things that have slipped through the cracks to, shifting left and, looking into each step of the process. and addressing accessibility at each stage, before it goes on to the next person. And it's been transformative for the organization and for the design practice as a whole. And there are, in introducing these things, we're able to catch accessibility issues much earlier on. There are some things that do still pop up, but we're able to fix those much more quickly. And in most cases, it doesn't even get that far. But thank you. So I wanted to see if anybody has any thoughts on any of that or any questions. They've asked that people come to the microphone, but if you want to ask from your chair, that's fine too. I can just repeat it. How many people here have accessibility as a focus of their practice or have tried to introduce accessibility?
Well, we have
A couple of people.
associated with it, and one of the team members is part of our design system team, so they are testing every component, and other members of the team are testing the production, kind of the two-stage process that you described. So we're following the same thing, although we're only now starting to get our design system in place.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I have a kind of high-level basic question.
Sure.
That in order for accessibility at scale, how important do you feel having a fully incorporated design system is part of solving this problem? Because I feel like in some of the government projects I've worked before, integrating the design system, if it wasn't started early enough, oftentimes got thrown out because there's thoughts about it's going to cost too much to implement it at this point because it's been a year into development. But then now we can't go into the build in all the nice things that you talked about later on, being able to have everything shift to the left, have it really early on. So any thoughts about that?
Sure. So, I mean, definitely having a design system makes it a lot easier. And I think there are cases that could be made to, the people who make the decision about whether, it's worth the investment to build one or not. I'd be happy to share some thoughts on that. But, I mean, even without that, if let's say that are you focused more on the design side of UX and interaction? So, I mean, even if so before we had the design system, we had our design toolkit in our widget library that, was based on components that were available. So we wanted to standardize the design. And so in that way, we're still able to bake accessibility into that process. It makes it a lot easier on the code side if those placeholders are there and color contrast is built into the components. But I think if you're able to standardize on design components, even without a design system, you can make a lot of progress. Yeah.
That's a wonderful presentation. I want to ask, do you experience any case whereby when you're trying to tackle the accessibility issues, does it affect the experience entirely? Like when you're trying to tackle the accessibility issue in this project of yours, do you have any other concern for the experience in general?
Like if accessibility has a potentially negative impact on the experience?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean that's something that comes up a lot where people have concerns with that. I would say one thing so that we haven't really experienced that. I mean there are still a lot of innovative and creative things that you can do while making sure that you're accounting for accessibility. It doesn't have to, and in our case, I don't think that it does at all negatively impact the experience. But anything that you make accessible is going to improve the experience for everybody who uses it. You know, a lot of times when we think about accessibility, we think in terms of people with disabilities, right? But, you know, Microsoft, they have an accessibility framework that I think describes it really well, where they talk about it on a scale of like, there's permanent disability, there's temporary disability. So permanent might be, you know, somebody has an amputated arm. Temporary could be like somebody's arm is in a cast. It's not, you know, a long time. To the other side of like situational, where, you know, it's not injured, but maybe I'm holding a bag, you know. So anything that, you know, that you introduce for accessibility, it's going to help everybody. The experience overall will be better.
You kind of answered my question, but how do you even defining accessibility? Like, is it like, are you solving for a permanent disability or like accessibility individual, or how do you even define the word from when you're solving accessibility issues? Because I know you mentioned the 3 criteria.
Yeah, so I mean, when, you know, I was kind of mentioning before that when we're thinking about accessibility, there's definitely, you know, you're considering the people who have disabilities, but, you know, accessibility is something, again, that improves the experience for everybody who uses, you know, whatever you're creating. But in terms of like how it's defined, like what is it that we're trying to fix, I guess it depends on which success criteria that, whether WCAG, which are like the kind of international standards, or if, for example, you're working on a government project, that's going to be defined by Section 508 trusted tester process. So what's needed to make something accessible is defined, but I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah, what I was trying to ask is within like 60% of something, because you have to know what your success metric is. And I'm
Mhm.
sure you can solve accessibility, but what is the success? I was trying to figure out what that is.
How do you measure? Okay, yeah. So, I mean, in our case, you know, well, let's take, for example, like WCAG. Most organizations try to achieve, so they're like different tiers of compliance, like A, AA, AAA. I think most organizations try to achieve AA. And so there's some changes that are coming with the next version of WCAG that's, you know, going to be coming out in the next couple of years. But for the most part, it's either like you're compliant or you're not. It's pretty clearly defined, like what's needed to achieve that success criteria. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. Appreciate the questions. Thanks.